Tony L. says, was apostolic tradition written down in the first and second centuries within the writings of the apostolic fathers and their successors like Irenaeus? Shouldn't we emphasize these written traditions? Well, apostolic tradition, much of it was written down in the first and second centuries in the apostolic fathers and their successors like Irenaeus. And Catholic apologists tend to do that. They do tend to emphasize these written traditions. I frequently recommend books of writings of the early church fathers. One of them, the Penguin edition called Early Christian Writings, played a role in my own conversion, and I often recommend that to others. Also, my own book, The Fathers Know Best, tracks the development of written apostolic tradition on different subjects. One thing to be aware of with tradition is it is not simply a collection of data. It's also interactive, so it grows over time. In church documents, it'll thus be referred to as live-in tradition because, for example, all of the different forms of the liturgy that have been developed in the last 2,000 years are expressions of apostolic tradition. Now, that doesn't mean everything in them comes from the apostles. Of course, it doesn't mean that. And so there's a distinction between data that does go back to the apostles and ways in which that data is embedded in larger structures like the liturgy. Also, there can be implications of things that do go back to the apostles that were not realized until later. Like, for example, a classic example that I use of this is Jesus is both fully God and fully man, and the fact that he's God is taught in the New Testament, and the fact that he's man is taught in the New Testament. And one of the implications of that we have no record of people in the apostolic age ever thinking about is he therefore must have two wills. He must have a divine will and he must have a human will. And so in Greek, two is duo, and will is thelema. And so this position that Christ has two wills is known as diotheletism. It's in contrast to another view that appeared at a certain point in church history called monotheletism, which held that Christ had only one will, that his human will was basically subsumed or annihilated in his divine will. But the Orthodox position, which is not something the apostles thought about, but can be derived from what the apostles did teach as an implication, is diotheletism, that Christ has two wills. Also, for that matter, the modern formulation of the Trinity that we use is based on data that goes back to the apostles, but it's a later way that tradition has expressed it based on inferences from things that the apostles taught. So we shouldn't think of apostolic tradition as just the data that goes back to the apostles, but also implications that that data contains that the apostles may not have even thought about. And it also, in a kind of lowercase t tradition, it also can be embedded in other structures such as the liturgy or traditional ways of articulating the faith, even though it's not new, fresh data. So that's a brief look at that, but apostolic tradition, much of it was written down in the first and second centuries, and apologists do point to that. And before we go, don't forget to like, comment, share the podcast with others, and subscribe. When you subscribe, hit the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have a new video. Thank you, and God bless you.